All right, Chapter 13, entitled The Rise of a Mass Democracy. So what that means, a mass democracy, is more or less in this chapter, we'll see more people getting involved in politics. So the intro. The intro is kind of reminding us of what just happened. So we just got out of the era of good feeling, which is the two-term presidency of our friend James Monroe. Remember, during this era of good feeling, there was really only one political party, but the idea of that era being an era of good feeling was not true. There was a lot of problems. So the problems that kind of burst the bubble of the era of good feeling were one, the Panic of 1819, which is a financial panic that was due to over-speculation of the Western land. And then another kind of bubble burster on our era of good feeling was the Missouri Compromise, which really served to highlight the disunity that was in America at this time. Kind of the idea of sectionalism is starting to form. So another thing that's going to kind of emerge in this chapter is the idea that political parties are a good thing. The Founding Fathers did not like the idea of political parties. They distrusted political parties, but now people in America are starting to see the benefits that can come from kind of having two voices in government. So because, there are kind of political parties here, that means that there's usually going to be a balance of opinion. So, the pendulum won't swing too far one way or too far the other way. If there are two political parties, they'll kind of balance each other out. Kind of the idea of checks and balances, making sure that there's a compromise somewhere in there. So that's changing. Something else that's changing is the idea of politicking is coming to prominence. Politicking is kind of a fancy word, I guess you could say, for campaigning. So before, George Washington definitely never campaigned for a presidency, but now we'll see people going, unabashedly out and campaigning, wanting to get your vote, kissing babies. They'll make banners. They will hold barbecues. Really campaigning. That's going to start happening in this chapter as well. So Section A, the corrupt bargain in 1824. So this whole section is going to be talking about the election of 1824. So remember, James Monroe had served his 2 terms of presidency, and now kind of the coast was clear, or the waters were open to whoever really wanted to throw their name into this election in 1824. Because remember, at this time, there really wasn't any political parties. So like today, present day, of course, we have our Democratic nominee and we have our Republican nominee. Pretty straightforward. But back in the day when there's no really political parties, really anyone who wanted to could run for president. And that's what happened. Election of 1824, a lot of people were running for president. But we'll talk about the top 4. Okay, we have John Quincy Adams, who had been Secretary of State under President Monroe. He had helped us a lot with gaining Florida, with finding a compromise in Oregon, with, the whole Monroe Doctrine thing, right? We have Henry Clay, who had brought forth the idea of the American system, which was an economic system we followed. We have a guy whose name is William Crawford. He's from Georgia. He doesn't win, obviously, because we don't say anything about him. And then we have Andrew Jackson, kind of the war hero of the War of 1812. So if I had been alive in 1824, I would have definitely put my money on Andrew Jackson. He was really kind of above and beyond. He was popular. Like I said, war hero because of that Battle of New Orleans. He also kind of more or less gained Florida for us. Just very, very popular. So election night comes around. And unfortunately, no one is able to claim the majority of electoral votes, meaning in the Electoral College, no one was able to get to that 51%. Because to become president, it's not whoever gets the most votes, but who gets to that 51% in the Electoral College. So because there were so many people running in this race, so many people putting their hats in for their names in the hat for this campaign, the votes were really kind of spread out, so no one was able to get the majority of votes in the Electoral College. So what happens then if you read the Constitution, and this is still how it runs today, if no one's able to get the majority in the Electoral College, then the top 3 vote getters, their names are placed before the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives then has the job of determining who is president among the top 3 candidates. So, unfortunately for our friend Henry Clay, he came in 4th place. So Henry Clay's name is now taken out of the race when it comes to presidency, for the presidency. However, he is very, very important because he is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's the leader in the House of Representatives. He has a lot of say and a lot of influence in the House of Representatives. So really now that this decision is placed in the House of Representatives, Henry Clay could more or less choose whoever he wanted to become president because he has that influence. So let's see what his options are here. So we have Andrew Jackson, our war hero. We have John Quincy Adams, our awesome Secretary of State. And then we have Crawford. And unfortunately for Crawford, he has a stroke, which leaves him paralyzed. So Crawford's name is kind of crossed off the list. So our friend Henry Clay gets to decide between Jackson and Adams. Henry Clay decides to throw his support behind Adams, mostly because he didn't like Jackson. Jackson and them had been rivals during this election, and they had disagreed over some things in the past. So Henry Clay has a private meeting with John Quincy Adams and says, hey, John Quincy Adams, hey, I'm going to throw my support behind you. So we have the House of Representatives voting, and guess what? Not unsurprisingly, John Quincy Adams becomes president. What? All right. So this is when the idea of a corrupt bargain starts to kind of circulate, kind of in the rumor mills. People start saying, hey, you know what I heard? I heard that John Quincy Adams met with Henry Clay and said that, hey, Henry Clay, if you throw your support behind me, in return, I will, as a reward, give you the position of Secretary of State. And remember, Secretary of State was just a stepping stone to the presidency. So people started to have these rumors of this corrupt bargain or this kind of underhanded deal that they said was going on. So they are saying John Quincy Adams promised Henry Clay that he could become Secretary of State if Henry Clay threw his support behind Adams. And more or less, we don't really know if this happened, but we do know it would be really out of character for Adams to do this. Adams was very religious, very kind of to the T when it came to the law, so it would be out of character for Adams for this to happen. And then conversely, the natural choice for Secretary of State would have been Henry Clay anyway. So really, there's no foundation for this corrupt bargaining actually happening, but regardless, it kind of leaves a stain on John Quincy Adams' character, kind of hovers over his head as he enters his presidency. All right, so let's talk about Section B, a Yankee misfit in the White House. So our Yankee misfit here is referring to John Quincy Adams. So this whole section is kind of talking about his personality and also why he kind of made a bad president. All right, so let's talk about him. So John Quincy Adams had been a wonderful, just superb Secretary of State. Great. However, as president, he was kind of lousy, and he had a number of weaknesses. For example, his personality was really cold, he kind of shunned other people. He was really smart, but he just wasn't a politician. You could say he was a horrible politician, right? He didn't he didn't kiss the babies. He didn't really care what people thought about him. So he wasn't really a good politician necessarily. Some things that kind of, weaknesses he had is that he was very nationalistic. So after the War of 1812, there had been this big surge of nationalism, but slowly over time, that had kind of, the pendulum had kind of swung in the opposite direction. So people weren't in general for nationalism anymore. So Adams, when he put forth the idea of building a national college, or building a national observatory, people were thinking, who do you think you are, Adams? Okay, so you want us to give you our money through taxes so you can build a college that we're never going to go to anyway? They really kind of saw him as an elitist. Okay, so that was kind of a weakness of his presidency. And let's see what else. Yeah, like I said, he wasn't a good politician, but he was very smart, he was very intelligent, and he was very moral. You know, followed the letter of the law to a T, didn't care what other people thought of him, his way or the highway. I am a righteous person almost to a fault. All right, so let's talk about Section C, going hog wild, or that's not the term, going whole hog for Jackson in 1824. So as soon as Jackson lost the campaign in 1824 against Adams, that next day he started campaigning for the next election, or the election of 1928. So all during Adams' presidency, Jackson was constantly there, kind of tearing down Adams, kind of bolstering his own reputation. So Jackson really put himself forth as kind of this rugged frontiersman, kind of like a people's people. You know, imagine him with work boots and a plaid shirt. And then conversely, he painted his opponent, or would-be opponent in the 1928 election, Adams, as kind of being a very elitist, very aristocratic guy. Okay? So even as soon as the 1924 election was over, Jackson started campaigning for the 28. All right. And so now you could say more or less there's a split in our one-party system between those who supported Adams and those who supported Jackson. Okay, let's see. Yeah, Jackson was called Old Hickory because he was tough as hickory, and Adams then adopted the oak tree. I don't know if that's important, but they mentioned it, so why not talk about it? And of course, what would an election be without a little mudslinging? So in this election, there was some mud being slung, okay? People were talking bad about Jackson. They were saying his mom was a prostitute. Like, wow, that's kind of mean, but whatever. It's mudslinging. They're saying his wife was an adulteress. They printed these pamphlets, you know, listing all the men Jackson had killed in duels. Okay? All right. People were also throwing mud at Adams. They were saying he had purchased a lot of gambling furniture for the White House, which wasn't true. What he did was bought a pool table, not exactly gambling fare. They were also, you know, pointing out how much money he had made as Secretary of State, and they even accused him of pimping out a servant girl to a Russian czar. So it was definitely mudslinging back and forth, but just as kind of a note to Adams' character, John Quincy Adams himself never threw mud at Jackson and never encouraged anyone to throw mud at Jackson. Okay, kind of showing he's very moral, very religious. Let's continue on. All right, Section D, Old Hickory as president. Old Hickory, of course, is our toughest Hickory President Andrew Jackson. So this section is more or less kind of one painting a picture of the character of Jackson, and also kind of painting a picture of what he represented to the American people. Andrew Jackson himself had kind of a rough life. He was born in a log cabin, had been orphaned at a young age. He wasn't very educated. They said his education or his university was adversity, saying he kind of had street smarts. Okay, he rose to prominence during the War of 1812, started getting involved in the politics of Tennessee, and kind of was an American success story, born in a log cabin, but now he was really a country gentleman. He had slaves, he owned a big plantation, he had one of the nicest houses in America. So really kind of American success story. An example of kind of who he represented to the American people, he was a representation of the common person, of, you know, just the people's people. And an example they show in this book is his inauguration, so when he becomes president. Okay, so when you become president, you usually give a speech, that sort of thing, you're sworn into office. But what he does is, after all this hoopla, he literally and proverbially opens the doors of the White House. So he just opens the doors of the White House and says, come on, we're having a party. So these common people, these clerks, these, I don't know, street sweepers, they start pouring into the White House. They're ruining the furniture, they're breaking the china, and, it's more or less the conservatives in Washington, D.C. says, this is the end of the world. Everything good and proper is now been thrown out the window. Andrew Jackson is in town, and he's not mincing words. He is there. He's the people's people. Awesome. They say, they threatened him with cracked ribs, which means, people would come up to Jackson and give him a bear hug. Not a typical presidential thing. Okay. All right, let's keep going on. I think that was all for that section. Okay, section E, the spoils system. Okay, this idea, to the victor goes the spoils, that phrase. So, what happens is when you become president, like I've mentioned before, it's your prerogative or it's your right to appoint a number of governmental positions or to fill those. So before this time, people really kind of left it be. They didn't really take advantage of this at all. But now that Andrew Jackson's in town, he takes full advantage of his right to give or to fill these governmental positions. And what he does, governmental, that's the name of the word, but what he does is he more or less uses this as a way to reward people who supported him during his campaign. So if people had donated a lot of money to him, he would reward them with a job, or a position, or if people had really just supported him, give them his time, their time, that sort of thing, they might give him a job. He might give them a job, that sort of thing. So what ends up happening is a lot of incompetent people are filling these positions. Kind of crooked people are filling these positions. Uneducated people are filling these positions. And one of the examples they give is this guy Samuel S. I have no idea how to pronounce that last name, so we'll just call him Sam. So Sam had been a big financial contributor to Jackson's campaign, and Jackson, as a way to reward Sam's loyalty, gave him the position of collecting taxes or customs at the port of New York. Hooray. So this guy Sam is slowly but surely kind of sneaking some money into his pocket as he's collecting these customs. So after a while, he takes about $1 million, literally, that's a lot of money back in the day. He takes $1 million, more or less steals it, and just, heads over to sea to Britain. So this is just an example of the corruption that can kind of creep in through the spoils system. So it's very, very clear that Jackson is giving jobs to people who supported him, but Jackson doesn't own up to that. He's saying, no, I'm just trying to get some fresh blood in here. There's people who've been here since George Washington. It's time to kind of get a new voice into government. So that's kind of more or less the spoils system, what's going on with that. And you can kind of see how the spoils system really lends itself to loyalty. So if, Andrew Jackson got you a job, you're probably going to be quite loyal to him. So it really kind of starts to polarize, you could say, political parties, because now people are really going to stick more or less to a candidate than they might have otherwise. All right, section F, the tricky tariff of abominations. Okay, so we'll talk about the abominations here in a little bit, but let's talk about what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. Right? The idea then is the imported goods, due to the tax, become more expensive, and so people are more likely to buy the American-made goods that are less expensive because you don't have to pay that tax. So the people in the North or the people in New England really like this because it encourages people to buy their manufactured products. Because the people in New England and in the North were more of the manufacturers, so they really benefited from the tariff. But the people in the South didn't like it because they didn't really get any benefits from it. All they got was expensive stuff. Okay? So the people in the South don't like it, the people in New England really like it. So that's kind of like a tariff. So what happens is kind of a long story, but you just have to trust me on this one. what happens is the supporters of Jackson, during John Quincy Adams' one term, the supporters of Jackson create a bill that has just this ridiculously high tariff on it. And the Jacksonians, their intention is not that the bill is ever passed. They do not want this bill to pass, in fact. But what they want to do is kind of give Adams' political career a black eye. I'm not going to explain the details of how it worked, but all they did is this is kind of a backhanded way to get back at Adams. They're going to put this really high tax up for a vote in Congress, whatever. So the Jacksonians are actually the ones who create this bill, not intending it for it to pass, but intending it to give kind of Adams' reputation a black eye. I'm not going to explain it. You don't really even need to know. So what happens is there's kind of an oops moment, because the bill does pass. Okay? So this bill passes, this abominable tariff, or a tariff of abominations passes, and the South freaks out, because the South has, the South, one thing, doesn't like tariffs, and this is an insanely high tariff. And the South is kind of sitting here looking around. They're looking at the Northeast, and they're seeing how much they're benefiting from the tariff. Then they're looking to the Northwest, and they're seeing that property values are increasing and people are making a lot of money in the frontier. And then they look to the Southwest, and they see people expanding into new territories, creating more cotton fields, and the South kind of feels stuck. They're just sitting here, and all they get from the federal government is, these tariffs, which make things just so expensive. Anyway, but as always, there's a deeper issue here, okay? It's not really about tariffs for the South. Yes, it's about tariffs for the South, but really there's a deeper issue, and that issue is slavery. The South is very nervous. Okay? We had Missouri Compromise. We had some attempted slave rebellions in the South. We have the abolitionist movement in Britain. Same anti-slavery movement was really picking up speed in Britain. Britain was looking like they were going to outlaw slavery. So all these things combined, the South is getting very defensive, very defensive. So when they get this tariff bill, this is them drawing a line in the sand, saying, leave us alone, federal government. If you force this tariff on us, the next step, you might force us to get rid of slavery. So this is, they're drawing their line in the sand. They are not going to deal with this tariff bill. So what happens is kind of South Carolina takes this issue and runs with it. John Calhoun from South Carolina writes a document called the South Carolina Exposition. And this South Carolina Exposition, it's not a law, it's not anything legally binding, but it's just a document that brings forth the idea of, hey, we should nullify, which means more or less ignore, this law within our state. All right. So now we get to Section G, nullies in South Carolina. Okay, so this issue of the tariff is really centered more or less now in South Carolina. All the southern states don't like it, but South Carolina is really the one kind of bringing arms. So South Carolina, in order to nullify or to get rid of this law, the tariff, they need to get 2/3 vote in Congress, in their state Congress. They need 2/3 of the people to agree to it to nullify this law. There are a minority of people in South Carolina who don't like this idea. They're called unionists. They're like, hey, South Carolina, we're part of a union here. You just have to compromise, give it up. That's really a small voice. So over the course of a year or so, the idea of nullification really takes off. So next time that there's an election in South Carolina's Congress, they have a new group of people, and because of this new election, they are then able to get that 2/3 majority they need to declare this law null and void, to get rid of it, to ignore it. So what they do, they call this convention in Columbia up, and the state of South Carolina votes kind of on two things. They say, one, we're going to nullify or get rid of this law, and two, if Washington, D.C. tries to come down here and force us to pay this law, we are going to leave the Union. It's kind of a big statement. But remember, it's not the tariff at issue here. It's really their idea. They're nervous that any federal control over South Carolina or of the South, that might lead to federal control on the issue of slavery. So you could say, hey, calm down, South Carolina. But it's really not about the tariff. It's about their right to make their own decisions. This is so exciting, I know. Tariffs in South Carolina. Anyway, let's keep talking, because I like to talk. Okay, so what ends up happening is Andrew Jackson, he's our war hero. He is very, very hot-headed, has a very extreme temper. Andrew Jackson is furious at South Carolina for kind of sticking up to the man this way. So what Andrew Jackson starts doing, he starts sending the Navy. He starts sending some of the Army down to South Carolina, and he starts building up this even bigger army. His idea is, if South Carolina does not back down, we are going to crush them. Alright, so now it's kind of a face-off between South Carolina and Andrew Jackson. So one of two things are going to happen. Jackson's going to go down there and crush South Carolina, or there's going to be some sort of compromise. Hey, guess what happens? A compromise happens. Our friend Henry Clay, he comes forth again and puts forth something called the Compromise Tariff of 1833. What this tariff more or less says is, over the course of 10 years, we'll slowly and gradually lower the tariff. And then after 10 years, it'll be more or less the same rate as it was before this whole mess started. But, kind of as a face-saving tactic of sorts, Congress still wants to assert their authority here, the federal government's authority. So they have this compromise, that's great, but they have something called the Force Bill, which says, if South Carolina, you do not pay us our tariffs, the national government has the right to send that Navy and that Army down there to collect these by force. So what ends up happening is more or less South Carolina accepts this compromise. And, you know, you can't really say Jackson won. You can't really say South Carolina won. It was a compromise. But if anything came out of this, Henry Clay is really kind of seen as, he's praised for saving the nation. You know, we're at the brink of, you know, almost like a civil war. And Henry Clay, this compromiser, putting forth this compromise tariff of 1833, is kind of seen as a national hero. And if this sounds familiar, South Carolina leaving the Union, that sort of thing, when we get to the Civil War down the road in the 1860s, it'll be South Carolina who's the first to secede. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of things to come. And with that, we are done with this video.